Well, good afternoon, friends. We're glad you've joined us for Face to Face with Racism this week to discuss weaponizing whiteness. Um, Heather and I are joining you this week from sunny Colorado. We're in Avon, Colorado for a week of vacation, but we just couldn't stay away from our conversation. So, um, so we're honored this week to be joined by Reverend Tom Bainham, Reverend Free McAdoo, Reverend Slats Toole, and Dr. Steph Budway. So we're going to get started. We'll start off with Tom, ask him to give a few words of introduction and take us away on framing the topic of weaponizing whiteness for us.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey and Heather, for inviting me and being with two of my good friends. Since you contacted me, I've given some thought to this, and the best way to describe it is to share with you a couple of examples where I've experienced or have been a part of weaponizing whiteness. The church where I serve is 99% white, and I had a church member come in my office one day back before the pandemic hit to talk about a variety of things. And towards the end of our conversation, he mentioned, he talked about his respect for me, and he said, "I really like you, and I voted for you to come as pastor." And then he said, I don't have anything against Black people. I've worked with blacks before in my job." And I sat there and smiled inside, saying, "Oh my goodness, strike one." So
Proximity.
when people make comments like that, it is a sense of weaponizing. It is they don't know what they're doing. And there was a time where I think we experienced that it was okay to do that. The other experience I thought about, and this was years ago when I was married. I just had knee surgery, and my wife and I were heading home from a party, and I was sitting in the back seat because I had to have my leg extended. She was driving, and we were going down a road in Richmond, and this woman kept pulling up beside her and then backing off and pulling up and backing off. And we didn't think anything of it. We get home, at about 5 minutes after we got in the house, there was a knock on the door. And so Brenda went and answered the door, and there was a Chesterfield County policeman there. And he said, "Do you own this car? You live here? We got a report of a Black man sitting in the back of your car. And this person was a little suspicious." At which point Brenda said, "Officer, would you come in, please?" And he walked in and saw me and said, "Let me introduce you to my husband who just had knee surgery." Now that happened over 30 years. What happened over 30 years ago. But I think for me, and there's several other instances, but I would share those two because I think that those are things that we say or that we interpret that just kind of give weaponize is a good word, or ammunition to this concept of whiteness by what we say or what we do or how we interpret. This is a discussion that we would not have had 30 years ago, but because of the where we are and the times that we're in, that would be my definition.
Okay, thanks. I think that's very helpful. Free, would you have thoughts you want to add?
Sure. So hi guys, my name is Reverend Freedom McAdoo. I go by Reverend Free. I am a elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where I serve under Reverend Dr. Michael Waters. Also my bishop, one of the first elected female bishops in the AME Church, Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie. So it is an honor to be here with you all. I also am a graduate of Perkins School of Theology came out in 2015, an MA board certified chaplain, clinical pastoral educator and chaplain. So my role in this conversation is really to kind of be able to articulate some of the nuances that we see when it comes to weaponizing whiteness, understanding that whiteness is in this year has first been identified as a part of the racial hierarchy. Let's just name that first. Whiteness has never been a piece of the structure of racism. It's always been Black, Latinos, indigenous people who have been identified as having a race. So that's the first thing, number one. When we think about whiteness, now in with our narratives embracing that whiteness is a part of the racial hierarchy, we also understand that whiteness has an infrastructure and a system to back its remaining in power, remaining in superiority, right? So when we talk about weaponizing whiteness, we're talking about how structures, policies, procedures, different domains, whether it be education, whether it be healthcare, whether it be any domain with the church, law enforcement, how all of these structures are in place to protect, to keep that hierarchy in place. And so when you have all of these systems that are working to keep whiteness as superior, what that does is everyone else that is not in that hierarchy becomes becomes a victim to it, pretty much. So as a chaplain working in the hospital, one example is oftentimes I'm at the bedside of people who are vulnerable. I used to work at Parkland Hospital Systems. I worked there for 7 years. As a chaplain, one of our roles is to definitely help patients identify meaning, help them find hope, but also our really important role is to be a advocate to the interdisciplinary team, which is predominantly white. We have most of our doctors come from UT Southwestern. Most of our nurses come from PWU or other Baylor School of Nursing, and most of our technicians also. So it's even a racial hierarchy in our medical system where not many Blacks, not many Latinos are doctors in our medical system. So there is a lack of diversity and understanding. When we would have families who would come in, and most of our Latino families, the entire family would come in. So you would have about 20 to 30 people to show up if someone was sick. And the type of racial innuendos and slurs that we as chaplains had to help our white providers, the doctors and the nurses understand was so egregious, and they would get so angry and then call in the attending and wanted to call the chief medical officer because it's too many people in the waiting room. And the lack of understanding from the physicians in regards to the culture of that family made the environment very tense. There are times when we've had on the women and children and infant area, when we had women who were giving birth, African American women, in response to white women, and the woman would say, "Hey, I'm in pain," and would wait hours to get pain medication, an African American woman. Well, if a white nurse came in and said she was in pain, then the doctor would hear her. But if she did not have an advocate that was white, she would be ignored most of the shift. And so we see these discriminatory practices that do cause very, very painful outcomes for people of color, and also in some cases death. And I'm not going to quote it, but we all know what happened to Serena Williams, who gave birth to her daughter. And this idea that Blacks can handle more pain than whites, and what that does in the medical system. And so I just want to raise that from my angle of being a public health theologian, and my understanding of even now in the discrimination of COVID and how we see that in white neighborhoods, police were passing out masks. But in Black neighborhoods here in Dallas, in Oak Cliff, they were passing out fines and tickets and writing people up. So that is weaponizing whiteness, and we're living in it right now.
Thank you. As disturbing as all of that is. I know, Tom, when you and I talked earlier this week, one of the things you mentioned was color blindness. And if those of you that have been with us for the last several weeks, we've talked about these different topics: color blindness, white privilege, white savior complex, microaggressions. And what I'm hearing is, I think, is that in some, maybe we might say, weaponizing whiteness is the underlying strategy, and color blindness or microaggression or cultural appropriation or cultural norms, like, oh, you speak really well.
Right.
That's the tactic that's used to weaponize. That's the instrument that's used. Is that a fair characterization?
That's fair. In fact, it is not uncommon in my life to be on the phone, and people, when they meet me in person, I'm not what they expected because of the way that I speak. When I was a child, when I was in elementary school, I used to get picked on for talking white. But it was because my parents taught me how to verbalize. But I do think it's a there's some whites who will say to me without thinking, you express yourself very well. Or I remember being on a mission trip when I was in high school, and we were singing at a church in the South, actually in Tennessee. And the pastor, after the concert, got up to speak, and I had done a solo, and he said, "Brother, you were just great. You remind me of O.J. Simpson." So, 30 or 40 years ago, that was not a big deal. But thinking back on it, it's there. That's kind of, there's this. In fact, I'm working my way through Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he talks about this issue of microaggression, and he says he doesn't even use that word anymore because it no longer it's a misrepresentation of the issue, and we have to be willing. And this is where one of the things that I need to do with my congregation. I'm getting ready to teach a course in the fall on racism, is helping them to understand these terms and the comments. How I know they in their heart, they don't feel like it's offensive, but it is offensive, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help the conversation. I think you're absolutely right. We have to be able, if Kendi's right, I think he is, we have to be willing to use the terminology and say whiteness is a part of racism, and be okay with that. And that's going to make a lot of white people, and a lot of white people in my congregation, uncomfortable. But I also think that we have to understand that if you want to have this conversation, if you're serious about wanting to move from block A to block B, part of the conversation is going to be difficult.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. I want to bring Slats and Steph into the conversation, and I don't want to misframe what you might have to say. I know when when each of us talked, you were both a little hesitant about what you might have to offer about weaponizing whiteness, but I know that both of you have experienced weaponizing gender. So Slats, thoughts?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Slats Tool. My pronouns are they, them. I am a writer and educator and activist within the Presbyterian Church USA. I just moved. Am currently still in the process of unpacking boxes from New Jersey to Minneapolis, which this is a exciting time to move to Minneapolis. The conversations that are happening here are really great, and so I'm grateful to see how I can be a part of what's happening here. Yeah, when I was first, when Jeffrey first approached me about this conversation, I wondered what I can contribute to this, and part of what I have been working with is growing up and existing as a queer person, particularly in environments where that has not been okay, and that has helped me keep myself in check as a white person when it comes to racial identity. So I remember growing up, I grew up in Virginia, and when I was growing up and starting to come into my identity as somebody who's attracted to all genders, sodomy laws were still on the books. And even though that was not where I was in my own development at the time, that played this role in this internalizing this hatred that was all around me. And so the place that was the most stressful place of my middle school existence was locker rooms. And that was not because I was necessarily afraid of someone beating me up or getting teased or that sort of thing, but I was so worried that I was going to look at someone the wrong way and they would assume that I was coming on to them, because in that situation, in that time, if a report was made about me, I was going to be the one who was going to be punished for that. So I was constantly monitoring my behavior to make sure that there is nothing that I could possibly do that anyone could say, oh, well, they looked at me this way, they must have a crush on me, they're creepy, they're harassing me, because if that escalated, it would not bode well for me. And that continues a little bit today whenever I go into a bathroom where I have to pick man or woman, and I kind of go with what I look like the most at that moment, and then work to really perform that gender properly so that I will be able to get through that experience without facing any harassment. And I have faced harassment in bathrooms, but at the same time, because I'm white, I haven't experienced much worse. And so I enter into this space where I am not welcomed because I'm transgressing what the dominant cultural understanding of gender is. But when we are like white people, weaponize whiteness to a point where we assume that all space is our space, and everyone who enters into that space needs to enter into it the exact way that we do and we're comfortable with. And so when somebody transgresses that by not being white, then they're facing that weaponized whiteness. So even though I've felt this very, very real anxiety as a queer person, it's not anything like our particularly trans people of color, especially Black and Latinx trans folks, face on a daily basis. And so having had that experience of having to perform gender in a specific way, and making sure that I'm not going too far in any direction, I then will kind of use that experience to check myself of, am I expecting other people to do that in other ways? Am I expecting other people to do that racially? Am I expecting other people to do that as far as class or ability? Even though the experiences are not the same, and it is not the same thing to be a queer person as to be a Black person, but there are some parallels that have helped me step into being a better white person.
Nice. Thank you for your vulnerability. All of you, thank you for your vulnerability. And thanks. I appreciate the intersectionality, because I think sometimes it helps us find ways to connect to another's experience. My experience might not be through race, but it might be through gender, or it might be through class. And then I can start developing empathy, right, through those intersectionalities. Steph, will you introduce yourself? And,
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Steph Budmay. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm the professor of worship and the arts at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and a church musician. And so just following up on what Slat said, and trying to think about what to say here, reading some things online, I was already quite aware of the heightened violence against Black trans folks, but some of the statistics are quite startling, that trans people are 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police than cisgender people. And 21% of Black trans women will face incarceration, and then they face the difficulties of which prison are they put into, are they allowed to have their hormones, and they're often put in solitary confinement for what is called their own safety, but of course, solitary confinement is one of the worst things you can do to a human being. So you really see here the intersection of gender and racism, and I don't know if any of you are familiar, but Laurel Schneider has a really interesting article. She's a theologian. It says, "What race is your sex?" And really helps us to think about these intersections of gender and racism going back to colonial times, where to keep, as what Reverend Free talked about, these hierarchies, that race was actually sexualized, that for white men, in order to keep their power, anyone who was white was seen as a dominant male, whereas all other races were seen as feminized and as submissive. And so that article really helps us to understand these really strong intersections of race and gender and class, and that when we start to pull on the thread, that is how we start to unravel these things, that these binaries, and that I do a lot of work with intersex folks, those who don't neatly fit into the category of male or female. And a lot of my work has made me realize that so much of what we deal with all of these different issues of racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia is the difference between, myself and the other, and how we look at that person who is other. And it's always in these binary oppositions. So this is who I am, and this is who I am not. And therefore who I am not is always a bad thing. And that creates these hierarchies of what's good and bad, and what's acceptable and not acceptable, what's normal and not normal, and what's human and not human. And that is how a lot of this othering is done, is by dehumanizing the other, and this is how we're able to treat people so horribly, is because we don't see them as human beings, we see them as an other. And so those were some of the things that came up as I thought about this today.
Thank you. You raise an interesting thought for me that takes us back to something that's come up in almost every conversation, and that is the issue of intent. Well-meaning white people, say, well, I didn't intend it that way. And the distance between intent and experience is, I don't know, perhaps insurmountable. Maybe that's what we're trying to surmount here. So, Steph, like, what you made me think of was, if all space is assumed to be white space, then as a Black person or a person of color, stepping into that space where everything is what you are not, then that can feel, I would think, like a battlefield, right? And so even though the intent might not have been to weaponize something, the experience is a weaponization because it inflicts pain, it inflicts wounds. Is this, am I getting something? I mean, am I putting it together right?
No, I really think so. And I think it really comes down to, as Reverend Free said, these hierarchies of, you know, and it really is when you talk about the intersection of gender and race, that it's the white heteropatriarchal male, that is the norm. And so that for anyone who does not fit into that norm, I think that, as you said, they experience that space as a battlefield because they don't fit into what that norm is. And also that there's this hierarchy of power, so that they're already felt to be seen at, you know, a lesser position, and they have to fight just to be in that space.
Our time is so fleeting, but I wonder if Tom or Free, if you have any initial responses or thoughts or reactions to some of the things that have come up before we sign off. You're muted. Free.
Oh, I was just offering some space for Tom to talk because I felt like I spoke a lot. But since I'm unmuted, let me first and foremost just say thank you for inviting me to the conversation. I was a little perturbed. I'm just going to be an African American woman, and I was like, why am I being invited to have this conversation about how whiteness is weaponized? That's not something that I should even. I don't feel like it's a place to offer that definition because very, very. I'm very connected to what Slat said and also what Professor Steph said because when we always have to, in any space that we walk into, are in a posture of having to fit into the mold of whiteness. Even the comment earlier that Tom made when he said when he calls people and they don't, they assume that he's someone else. He looks different. It's this this grooming that sometimes my Black family has had to teach me to fit into white spaces. And so it's a constant paranoia to a degree. Do I fit in? They understand me. And it's a comparing of myself to the white cultural norm all the time. And it is emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally exhausting to have to live and we live like this all day. I think one of the reasons that we're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement and marches where children, teenagers, and even middle school age children are now marching because they resonate with this pain and this heaviness of carrying pretty much like a cross, carrying their cross of having to live in this comparison, and they feel like they're just as valuable too. So I think that's kind of like my last thoughts that I want to kind of offer is that we still have to continue to have these conversations. So Tom, I just want to offer prayer and just blessings on your work that you do with your congregation. And lastly, when I was thinking about just like Nick Cannon and these different people who spoke up, sometimes foolishly, sometimes ignorantly, and how they've kind of postured certain things, how another aspect of weaponizing whiteness is people losing their jobs, right? And not to slight Parkland, the program that I created is specifically for Black communities to help them with preventative education. When we start seeing a rise in COVID-19, and what is needed right now is to get people out to help give education and masks, what has happened is I was laid off at the height of COVID-19 as a Black woman, the only Black woman sitting in the C-suite, right? So I'm a little too loud. I'm a little too direct, right? I don't fit in, so let me lay you off. And so that's how, again, just to kind of close that piece out, that's how it happens for Black people who do not fit.
Amen.
Tom, any closing thoughts?
Several, but I would share one, and that is that, as sad as it is, a lot of the battling of dealing with weaponizing whiteness, unfortunately happens in the place where we hang out, where most of us hang out every Sunday morning. It's in the church. I serve in a denomination here in St. Louis, or in Missouri, where in my association, I am the only minister of color, and in the entire denomination, which covers 4 states, I am one of 11. So I think the difficulty in dealing with this with whiteness and weaponizing is that we're going to have to address it within our places of faith, and we're going to have to deal with it with some of our colleagues. It is rampant in parts of the church, Big C, that are slightly, probably a little bit more, not as progressive as we are. But I think that's the reality.
Thanks. Our time is short, and it's not enough to cover it all in this session, but we will have another conversation that comes out on Tuesday. So we encourage you to look for that.
It was a Mustang.
Ah.
Yeah, so as we have these conversations, of course, as we say each week, be sure to take care of yourself. I think that especially this conversation about weaponizing whiteness, since it is really the underlying piece that's sort of foundational to so much of racism that we see, we all participate in it, and we all see how it is in our lives. And so as we come across those things, be kind to yourself. Take the time to learn and to make changes slowly, and make changes in the right direction, but don't beat yourself up. And we will be back next week with our next conversation. We don't have the list with us.
I don't remember. I'm on vacation.
We're on vacation, but we'll be back next week. And of course, like Jeffrey said, the backstage of this conversation will be back on Tuesday.